For 20 years, every single full moon, I watched the same man walk out of the darkness, carrying a heavy locked chest to the edge of the forest beside our convent. He would dig, he would bury it, and then before sunrise, he would be gone. The following full moon, he would come back, pull it out of the ground, and disappear again with it. 20 years, 240 full moons. The same man, the same chest, the same ritual, and I never said a word to anyone who believed me. By the end of this story, you will understand why I never once dared to interrupt him and why the truth inside that chest was nothing like anything I had imagined. To understand why I kept returning to that lonely hill every full moon, you need to understand who I was before any of this began. I was a woman of quiet habits and deep routine. I had entered the convent of St. Marin's in my mid-20s, not out of desperation or escape, but out of genuine calling. The convent sat on a stretch of land in a wooded valley in rural Pennsylvania, surrounded by oak forest so old and dense that on cloudy nights you couldn't see 20 feet into it. There were stone ruins on the property, an abandoned cemetery behind the East Chapel, the remains of a stone watchtower so overgrown with ivy that most of the younger sisters didn't even know it existed. I loved that tower. I loved the ruins. I was the kind of person who needed to know the story behind every abandoned thing. I spent my free hours in our small archive room, reading letters from the 1800s, studying old property maps, tracing the handwriting of women who had lived in these same stone walls 150 years before me. I was practical, methodical, and deeply skeptical of anything I couldn't verify with my own hands. The older sisters teased me gently about it. They said I had the spirit of an archivist living inside a nun's habit, and I took long walks at night. That was my private practice. When my mind was heavy with thought, I would walk the outer grounds after Compline, the last prayer of the evening. I wore my heaviest cloak in cold months and carried a small lantern. The forest edge was my favorite destination. Something about standing where the cleared land ended and the old woods began always settled something deep inside me. That is exactly where I first saw him. It was October. The moon was enormous and full, flooding the hilltop clearing in silver light. I had stopped at the tree line as I always did, standing there in the dark, breathing in the cold air, and then I heard it, a slow, measured scraping sound, like a shovel finding resistance in dry earth. I stepped back into the shadow of the closest oak and watched. A man emerged from the deeper forest carrying a wooden chest roughly the size of a large suitcase. It had a metal lock on the front that caught the moonlight. He was perhaps 60 years old, gray-haired, dressed plainly in dark clothing, moving with the calm, deliberate focus of someone who had done this 1,000 times before. He set the chest down, finished digging, lowered the chest gently into the hole, covered it completely, smoothed the earth, scattered dead leaves over the disturbed ground, and then he walked back into the forest without once looking behind him. I stood there for a long time after he disappeared. My lantern was unlit. I had been invisible in the shadow, and I told myself some rational explanation would come to me by morning. A farmer securing valuables, a man with eccentric habits, something ordinary. The next full moon, I came back. He came back. Same chest, same hole, same silence, same disappearance before dawn. I told Sister Agnes what I had seen. She smiled patiently and said the old stories about the forest had a way of playing with the imagination at night. I told Sister Bernadette. She suggested I pray about it. I brought it up to our Reverend Mother once, carefully and calmly, and she listened with great kindness before gently redirecting the conversation toward my other duties. No one believed me. Or rather, no one wanted to engage with something so quietly strange, so I stopped telling people, and I kept watching. The years moved the way years do inside a convent, slowly and with great texture. I learned his patterns. He always arrived within the same 2-hour window before moonset. He always used the same spot, slightly northeast of the broken stone wall near the old watchtower. He never varied. He never rushed. And over the years I began to notice small things. The chest had symbols carved into its lid. Not decorations, deliberate markings arranged in a pattern. I couldn't see them clearly from a distance, but they were consistent, geometric, almost like a map. In year 4, I found something in our archive room that made me stop breathing. Buried inside a folder of old property disputes from the late 1800s was a hand-drawn survey map. It showed the convent grounds, the forest boundary, and the watchtower, but it also showed a small parcel of land adjacent to our property labeled with a family name I didn't recognize. Vanek. The parcel had been privately held, then apparently abandoned, then absorbed into a larger estate. The record stopped abruptly in 1943. In year 6, I started asking the oldest people in the nearby village careful, casual questions. An elderly woman named Mrs. Horak, whose grandmother had come from Czechoslovakia before the war, told me something over tea that I have never forgotten. She said her grandmother used to speak of a family who had carried something precious out of Europe during the Nazi occupation. Documents, she thought. Or paintings. She didn't know the details. Her grandmother had said only that the family had made a sacred promise to keep whatever it was hidden until the world stopped trying to destroy beauty. The name Vanek meant nothing to Mrs. Horak, but the timing meant everything to me. In year 9, I noticed for the first time that the man was graying more visibly. He moved more slowly. And once, just once, he paused before re-entering the forest and looked up at the moon for a long moment with an expression I can only describe as exhausted devotion, like a man finishing a shift no one else could take. It broke something open in me that I hadn't expected. I felt, for the first time, something close to grief for him. I started looking for coded patterns in the old convent letters from the 1940s. I found a series of entries in the handwriting of a former abbess, referencing an agreement made with a local family. The entries were cryptic but consistent. She wrote of a promise made during wartime. She wrote that the land near the watchtower would remain undisturbed and unquestioned. She wrote, and this line I memorized completely: "Some things must be buried not from shame, but from love, and retrieved only when safety finally arrives." I sat with that sentence for the next 3 years. By year 18, I had pieced together most of it. The Vanek family had been curators and collectors in Prague before 1938. When the occupation began, they had compiled something irreplaceable: original testimonies from Jewish families in their region. Hundreds of handwritten accounts of lives, names, family histories, cultural records, songs, prayers, and genealogies that would otherwise be erased entirely. They had sealed these documents into a chest and carried them out of Europe through extraordinary risk. They had arrived in Pennsylvania with almost nothing, but they still had the chest. The monthly burial ritual was not mystical. It was legal strategy. For decades, a distant branch of a formerly collaborating family had contested cultural assets across the region through obscure international legal channels. As long as the documents remained uncatalogued and untransferred into any official institution, they remained safely outside the reach of those claims. A lawyer had advised the Vanek family that the documents needed to remain technically buried, literally and legally unrecorded, until a specific international statute expired, and every full moon, the chest was buried to maintain that legal continuity and retrieved to ensure the documents remained undamaged. The ritual was protection through patience. But I didn't know the last piece of the story yet. I didn't know it until year 19, almost to the day. That night I stepped slightly closer than I ever had. The moon was bright and I miscalculated my shadow. The man lowered the chest into the ground, stood up, and turned. He looked directly at me. I froze completely. My heart was somewhere near the back of my throat. He didn't run. He didn't shout. He simply looked at me for a long moment. And then he said, quietly and without any anger at all, "I was wondering when you would finally step out of the shadows. I've known you were watching for a long time. I've been hoping you were the one I could trust with what comes next." His name was Pavel Vanek. He was the grandson of the man who had carried the chest out of Prague in 1939. He told me everything on that cold hillside, speaking in the measured, careful sentences of a man who had rehearsed this conversation in his mind for years. The statute had finally expired. The legal threat had dissolved 6 months earlier, but he was 73 years old and without children. He needed someone to help him transfer the chest's contents properly to a university archive, someone connected to the land, someone who had already quietly proven they could keep a secret for 2 decades without once breaking it. A year later, I sat beside Pavel in a room at the University of Pennsylvania as archivists in white gloves carefully lifted document after document from that chest. Hundreds of pages, handwritten testimonies from families who had been killed before the war's end, names, stories, prayers in languages that barely survived the 20th century, records of entire communities preserved with extraordinary care by a family who had sacrificed ordinary life to carry them safely across an ocean. Pavel wept silently beside me. I held his hand and said nothing because there were no words large enough for what we were witnessing together. Pavel passed away 14 months after the transfer was completed. He died peacefully and, I believe, finally rested. The documents are now fully cataloged, carefully preserved, and digitally accessible to descendants and researchers across the world. The names of those families exist because one family refused to let them disappear, and because one woman chose patience over interruption. I think about that choice often. I wonder sometimes what would have happened if I had confronted him in year 1, or year 5, or year 10, whether my impatience would have fractured the quiet trust that made the ending possible. And what I've come to understand is this: not every buried secret exists to hide the truth. Sometimes the truth must be protected, kept underground, kept silent, kept safe until the world is finally ready to preserve it instead of destroying it. Some people spend their entire lives not being remembered, and that is exactly the point. So I want to ask you something. Honestly, would you have confronted him in year 1, or would you have waited 20 years to learn the truth? Tell me in the comments. I genuinely want to know. And if this story completely changed everything you thought that locked chest contained, please share it. Because some stories deserve to travel further than the place where they were buried.